You don't belong in first class, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Those words would echo through courtrooms, congressional hearings, and living rooms across America within 72 hours, but at 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Chicago. O'Hare International Airport. They were still 20 minutes away from being spoken. For now, 10-year-old Elijah Barnes stood beside his father in the exclusive Platinum Lounge, his small hands gripping a red backpack, while Michael Thompson knelt down to meet his son's eyes, the way he always did when something important needed to be said. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the silver in Michael's temples, making him look distinguished rather than old, successful rather than tired, though he was certainly both after another sleepless night reviewing defense contracts that would reshape how America protected its skies. Thompson Aerospace had grown from a garage startup to a billion-dollar empire in 15 years, and Michael had learned that success meant always being 3 steps ahead of disaster, which was exactly why his stomach felt tight as he looked at his son's face. "Everything's arranged, Elijah," Michael said, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and tenderness that only fathers seem to master. "Seat 2B, first-class window seat just like you wanted, and the flight attendants have been notified that you're traveling alone to see Grandma Rosa in Miami." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out what appeared to be an ordinary smartwatch, sleek black, with no visible logos or flashy features, just clean lines and a dark screen that reflected the terminal lights like still water. "This isn't just any watch," Michael continued, fastening the band around Elijah's thin wrist with hands that had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions, but trembled slightly when adjusting the strap on his son's watch. "It looks normal. Acts normal, tells time like any other watch. But if anything goes wrong, anything at all, that makes you uncomfortable or scared, you press and hold the crown for 3 seconds. He demonstrated the motion, his finger pressing against the small metal button on the side of the device. 3 seconds, and every security protocol I've ever built activates instantly. Elijah nodded solemnly, understanding without needing detailed explanations that his father's work involved protecting important people and that sometimes even a 10-year-old boy needed that kind of protection. The weight of the watch felt reassuring against his skin, not because he expected trouble, but because it represented his father's love made tangible, an invisible thread connecting them across whatever distance the day might bring. "I know you're nervous about flying alone," Michael said, though Elijah hadn't spoken his concerns aloud because Thompson men learned early that strength meant acknowledging fear without being controlled by it. "But you're ready for this, son. You've been ready since you were 7 years old and talked that security guard out of giving me a parking ticket by explaining the legal precedent for emergency vehicle access." Michael's smile was genuine proud, tinged with the bittersweet knowledge that his boy was growing up faster than either of them wanted. "I'm not nervous about flying, Dad," Elijah replied, adjusting his navy blue polo shirt and checking that his boarding pass was secure in his front pocket. "I'm excited to see Grandma Rosa. And I know you taught me everything I need to know about being respectful and polite to people even when they're not respectful and polite back." This was a lesson they'd practiced many times in many different ways, because Michael Thompson knew that his son would face challenges in the world that had nothing to do with his character, and everything to do with other people's limited imagination about what a young black boy was capable of achieving. Across the lounge, a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit folded his Wall Street Journal and checked his watch with the kind of casual precision that suggested military training. David Kim had been Thompson Aerospace's head of personal security for 3 years, and while his official cover story involved business development meetings in Miami, his actual job today was ensuring that Elijah Barnes Thompson made it safely to his grandmother's house without realizing he was being protected every step of the way. The boarding announcement for Premium Airlines Flight 847 crackled through the lounge speakers, and Michael stood his knees protesting slightly after years of sitting in boardrooms and congressional briefings. He pulled Elijah close, breathing in the familiar scent of his son's shampoo mixed with the lingering traces of breakfast syrup, committing this moment to memory because something deep in his parental instincts whispered that today was going to be different, though he couldn't have imagined just how different. "Walk like you belong everywhere you go," Michael said, the Thompson family motto that had carried 3 generations from poverty to prominence. "Because you do belong, son. Always remember that." He kissed the top of Elijah's head, tasting the sweetness of childhood that would fade too soon, and watched his boy walk toward the gate with the confident stride of someone who had never been told he didn't deserve whatever space he occupied. The jet bridge felt cooler than the terminal, and Elijah's sneakers made soft squeaking sounds against the textured floor as he made his way toward Premium Airlines Flight 847, his boarding pass reading 2B in crisp black letters that matched the confidence in his step. Behind him, David Kim maintained the perfect distance of someone heading to his own seat, while keeping Elijah in his peripheral vision, a skill learned through years of protecting people who couldn't know they were being protected. "Welcome aboard, sweetheart." Sophia Martinez appeared at the aircraft entrance like a ray of sunshine, her genuine smile immediately setting Elijah at ease in the way that only truly kind people can manage. At 24 years old and 6 months into her flight attendant career, Sophia still believed that every passenger deserved to feel special regardless of their age or the price of their ticket, which was exactly why she'd chosen this job over the corporate finance position her MBA could have secured. "Thank you, ma'am," Elijah responded with the kind of polite formality that made adults smile and remember why they liked children in the first place. "I'm flying to Miami to visit my grandmother, and this is my first time in first class, so I'm pretty excited about the experience." His honesty was disarming, the way children's honesty always is, cutting through adult pretense to remind everyone listening that wonder still existed in the world. Sophia's heart melted a little as she scanned his boarding pass, noting the special handling codes that indicated unaccompanied minor status with additional security protocols, though she didn't understand why a routine domestic flight would carry such extensive documentation. "Well, you're in for a treat, Mr. Barnes," she said, reading his name from the passenger manifest. "Seat 2B has the best view for takeoff, and I'll make sure you get extra pretzels during service." From the forward galley emerged Rebecca Walsh, and the temperature of the entire interaction dropped 10 degrees without anyone saying a word. At 43 years old, with 16 years of seniority at Premium Airlines, Rebecca carried herself like someone who had seen every type of passenger emergency complaint and disruption that commercial aviation could produce and had developed exactly zero patience for any of it. Her uniform was pressed to perfection. Her graying blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin around her eyes, and her expression suggested that she viewed every flight as a military operation where passengers were potential threats to her carefully maintained order. Rebecca's gaze swept across Elijah in a single, comprehensive assessment that took in his young face, his dark skin, his casual but neat clothing, and the red backpack slung over one shoulder, and something inside her brain clicked with the kind of wrongness that she had learned to trust over 16 years of managing cabin environments. A 10-year-old black boy, traveling alone in first class, didn't fit her mental model of how the world was supposed to work, which meant either there had been a mistake in seating assignments or someone wasn't telling her the complete truth about this passenger. "Sophia, I need to see the manifest for this section," Rebecca said with the kind of authoritative tone that made it clear this wasn't a request. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent years dealing with paperwork errors, passenger complaints, and junior staff members who didn't understand that experience mattered more than enthusiasm when it came to maintaining safety and order at 30,000 feet. The first-class cabin was filling with the usual Tuesday morning crowd of business travelers, most of them already absorbed in their phones or laptops, settling into seats that cost more than some people made in a month. In 2C and 2D, Walter and Margaret Foster were arranging their crossword puzzle books and discussing their dinner plans for Miami, a ritual they'd maintained through 42 years of marriage and countless flights to visit their grandchildren. Walter, 74 years old, with hands that still bore the calluses of his construction worker days, glanced up from his reading glasses to notice the young boy finding his seat, and something in the child's polite demeanor reminded him of his own grandson learning to navigate the adult world. Janet Liu, a technology executive in seat 3B, was already deep into reviewing quarterly reports on her tablet, her noise-canceling headphones creating a bubble of productivity that she protected fiercely during flights. At 38, Janet had built her career on the ability to focus completely on whatever task demanded her attention, but something about the interaction between the flight attendants and the young passenger made her look up from her spreadsheets, though she couldn't quite identify what had caught her attention. Elijah made his way to seat 2B with the careful movements of someone who understood that first-class spaces deserved respectful treatment, settling his backpack under the seat in front of him and buckling his seatbelt with the kind of methodical precision that would have made his father proud. The leather seat was softer than anything in his experience, and the window beside him offered a perfect view of the ground crew's loading luggage, with the choreographed efficiency of people who had performed these same movements thousands of times. "Everything looks good from here," he murmured to himself, a habit he'd developed during moments when his father wasn't around to provide reassurance. The watch on his wrist felt solid and comforting, a tangible reminder that he was connected to the most important person in his world, even when separated by the logistics of travel and the demands of adult schedules. David Kim settled into seat 4A with the practiced invisibility of someone whose job required blending into any environment, opening his Wall Street Journal to the business section while positioning himself for optimal observation of both Elijah and the cabin crew. His trained eyes cataloged the layout, the passenger demographics, the crew dynamics, and the subtle tension he could already sense building around the young boy in 2B. Though Kim hoped his paranoia was getting the better of his professional judgment. Rebecca returned from the galley with a clipboard in her hand and an expression that suggested she had discovered something that required immediate attention, though what she had actually discovered was exactly what she expected to find: a passenger manifest that didn't contain the detailed family information she thought should accompany a child traveling alone in first class. The absence of information felt like confirmation of her suspicions, rather than evidence of normal travel arrangements, because Rebecca Walsh had learned long ago that when something felt wrong, it usually was wrong. Rebecca approached seat 2B with the purposeful stride of someone who had identified a problem that needed solving. Her clipboard held like a shield against whatever explanation she was about to hear. The cabin was settling into the pre-flight routine that experienced travelers recognized as the calm before the controlled chaos of departure, but Rebecca's presence beside Elijah's seat carried a tension that made several nearby passengers look up from their phones and magazines without quite understanding why. "Excuse me, young man," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness that adults use when they're about to ask questions they already doubt the answers to. "I need to verify some information about your travel arrangements because our passenger manifest doesn't show the complete details we usually require for unaccompanied minors in this cabin section." She held her clipboard at an angle that suggested official importance while studying Elijah's face for signs of the nervousness that would confirm her suspicions. Elijah looked up at her with the kind of direct eye contact his father had taught him to maintain with adults showing respect while refusing to be intimidated by authority that might not have his best interests at heart. "Yes, ma'am. My boarding pass shows seat 2B, and my father made all the arrangements through your customer service department," he said, reaching into his front pocket to retrieve the boarding pass along with a folded envelope that bore the distinctive letterhead of Thompson Aerospace Industries. The letterhead was elegant without being flashy, featuring the company logo that anyone in the defense industry would recognize immediately, though Rebecca's experience was limited to commercial aviation and the kind of corporate travelers who complained about legroom and Wi-Fi speeds. "My father wrote this letter to explain the travel arrangements and provide contact information in case there are any questions." Elijah continued offering both documents with the polite formality that made him seem older than his 10 years. Rebecca accepted the papers with the skeptical expression of someone who had seen every type of forged document and creative explanation that passengers could produce when caught in seating violations or ticketing errors. The boarding pass appeared legitimate with the proper barcodes and seat assignment clearly printed in the airline's standard format, but the letter made her eyebrows rise in the way that suggested professional suspicion rather than impressed recognition. The Thompson Aerospace letterhead was certainly impressive, featuring embossed gold lettering and a watermark that caught the cabin lighting as Rebecca tilted the page to examine it more closely. The letter itself was brief and professional, explaining that Elijah Barnes Thompson was traveling to Miami to visit his grandmother, that all arrangements had been made through Premium Airlines' unaccompanied minor program, and that any questions should be directed to Michael Thompson's direct office line, which was printed at the bottom, along with an extension that bypassed the usual corporate directory. "Anyone can print a letterhead these days," Rebecca said after examining the document for several long seconds that felt like an eternity to Elijah, who was beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't routine verification, but something closer to an interrogation. "We see all kinds of creative attempts to upgrade seating or get around our policies, especially when it involves children who might not understand the implications of what they're being asked to do." The words hit Elijah like a physical blow, not because they were loud or obviously cruel, but because they carried the implication that he was either lying or being used in some kind of deception that he was too young to understand. The accusation violated everything his father had taught him about how people should treat each other regardless of age or appearance, and for the first time since boarding the aircraft, Elijah felt the flutter of anxiety in his chest that told him this situation was different from the normal adult questions he was accustomed to handling. "Ma'am, I'm not trying to upgrade anything or get around any policies," Elijah replied, his voice steady despite the growing realization that Rebecca Walsh didn't believe him and wasn't particularly interested in being convinced otherwise. "My father purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago, and I have the confirmation email on my phone if you need to see additional documentation." He reached for his phone with the careful movements of someone who understood that sudden gestures might be misinterpreted by adults who were already suspicious. Walter Foster looked up from his crossword puzzle with the sharp attention of someone who had raised 4 children and recognized the particular tone that adults used when they were being unfair to young people. His wife Margaret touched his arm with the gentle pressure that couples develop over decades of marriage to communicate without words. But Walter's expression was already hardening into the protective stance he had always taken when children were being treated poorly by people who should know better. Sophia Martinez approached from the rear of the cabin with a beverage cart, but her usual efficiency was slowed by the growing awareness that something uncomfortable was happening in first class, something that involved the polite young boy who had been nothing but respectful since boarding the aircraft. Her training had covered many types of passenger conflicts, but the dynamic she was witnessing didn't fit any of the standard categories she had learned to navigate. "I'm going to need to contact my supervisor about this situation," Rebecca announced with the tone of someone who had made a decision and wasn't interested in further discussion. "There are protocols for unaccompanied minors that need to be followed exactly, and I'm not confident that all the proper procedures have been completed in this case." She folded Elijah's letter and boarding pass together, treating them like evidence rather than legitimate travel documents. Janet Liu removed one of her noise-canceling headphones, her business instincts alerting her to a conversation that had moved beyond routine customer service into territory that might require witness testimony. As someone who had spent years in corporate environments where discrimination lawsuits could destroy careers and companies, she recognized the particular combination of authority and prejudice that was beginning to unfold in the row ahead of her. Elijah felt the watch on his wrist grow slightly warm against his skin, though he couldn't tell if this was his imagination or some kind of stress response feature his father had built into the device. The sensation reminded him of his father's presence and the confidence that came from knowing he was loved and supported, even when facing adults who seemed determined to make him feel small and unwelcome in spaces he had every right to occupy. "Could I please just call my father to confirm the arrangements?" Elijah asked the question, carrying both politeness and the subtle desperation of someone who understood that the situation was escalating beyond his control. "He's probably still in the airport, and he can speak with your supervisor directly to clear up any confusion about my ticket or travel authorization." Rebecca's expression suggested that she viewed this request as further evidence of deception rather than a reasonable solution to what should have been a simple verification process, and her response would determine whether the next hour unfolded as a routine flight or something that would change multiple lives forever. "I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation," Rebecca said, her voice dropping to the level that flight attendants used when they wanted to avoid drawing attention from other passengers, while making it clear that compliance wasn't optional. "Seat assignments in first class are based on specific criteria, and when those criteria haven't been met, we have the authority to make adjustments that ensure the safety and comfort of all our passengers." The words hung in the cabin air like smoke from an electrical fire, acrid and impossible to ignore, though Rebecca had chosen them carefully to sound official rather than discriminatory to anyone who might be listening. Elijah felt his chest tighten with the particular kind of anxiety that comes from being accused of something without understanding exactly what crime he was supposed to have committed, and his young mind raced through every interaction since boarding, searching for mistakes he might have made that could justify this treatment. "Ma'am, I haven't done anything to make other passengers uncomfortable," Elijah said, his voice carrying the careful control his father had taught him to maintain when adults were being unreasonable. "I put my backpack under the seat. I buckled my seatbelt. I was polite to everyone, and I haven't asked for anything except to verify my travel arrangements with my father." Each word was measured and respectful, though underneath his composed exterior, Elijah was beginning to understand that politeness and logic might not be enough to resolve whatever was happening. Rebecca's jaw tightened in the way that suggested she was being personally challenged by a child who should have accepted her authority without question, and her 16 years of experience managing difficult passengers had not prepared her for dealing with someone who remained respectful while refusing to be intimidated. "Young man, I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive, and I know when something doesn't fit our standard procedures," she said, her voice growing sharper despite her attempts to maintain professional composure. The fabric of the first-class cabin seemed to absorb sound differently now, as if the entire space was holding its breath while waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve itself. Walter Foster set down his crossword puzzle entirely and leaned forward in his seat, his weathered hands gripping the armrests with the kind of tension that came from watching injustice unfold in real time. His wife, Margaret, whispered something about minding their own business, but Walter's expression suggested that some situations were too important for polite distance. "Rebecca, perhaps I could help verify the passenger information," Sophia Martinez interjected, approaching with the kind of diplomatic smile that junior staff members used when they needed to challenge senior colleagues without appearing insubordinate. "I could call our customer service department to confirm the unaccompanied minor arrangements or contact the supervisor to review the special handling codes on the manifest." The suggestion was reasonable, professional, and exactly the kind of solution that should have de-escalated the situation, but Rebecca's response made it clear that this was no longer about following procedures or verifying documentation. "Sophia, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this is exactly the kind of situation where experience matters more than good intentions," Rebecca said with the patronizing tone that senior employees use to remind junior staff about hierarchy and decision-making authority. David Kim folded his Wall Street Journal with movements that appeared casual but were actually the precise choreography of someone preparing to intervene in a situation that was spinning beyond acceptable parameters. His training had taught him to recognize the specific combination of authority, prejudice, and escalation that could turn routine encounters into incidents requiring official response, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that Rebecca Walsh was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I understand there might be confusion about my ticket," Elijah said, trying one more time to find a reasonable solution before the situation deteriorated further. But my father purchased this seat specifically because he wanted me to be comfortable during the flight, and he made sure all the proper arrangements were completed through your official channels. His voice was steady, but the slight tremor in his hands revealed the stress he was working to control. Rebecca reached for the letter and boarding pass again, but this time her movements were more aggressive than investigative, and something in her expression suggested that she had moved beyond skepticism into active resentment of being questioned by someone she viewed as fundamentally out of place in her cabin. "I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and follow me to economy class," she announced, her voice carrying the finality of someone who had made a decision and wouldn't be argued with further. The words fell across the first-class cabin like a declaration of war, and the casual conversations that had been providing background noise suddenly stopped as passengers realized they were witnessing something far more serious than a routine seating issue. Janet Liu pulled out her phone and opened the camera app with the practiced speed of someone who understood that some moments needed to be documented regardless of social etiquette or personal convenience. "Ma'am, my ticket clearly shows seat 2B in first class," Elijah replied, his voice growing smaller despite his efforts to maintain confidence. "I don't understand why I need to move when I have the proper documentation and I haven't caused any problems for anyone." The confusion in his voice was genuine, the bewilderment of someone too young to fully comprehend that fairness and logic didn't always determine how the world treated people. Margaret Foster reached across the aisle and touched her husband's arm again, but this time her gesture carried urgency rather than caution, because she could see in Walter's face the same expression he had worn 30 years earlier, when their own grandson came home from school with stories about teachers who seemed determined to find fault with everything he did. Some fights were too important to avoid regardless of the personal cost of getting involved. "Because I said so." Rebecca snapped her professional mask, finally slipping to reveal the frustration and resentment that had been building since she first saw Elijah in what she considered her domain. "I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, and passenger safety and comfort are my responsibility, which means I have the authority to make seating adjustments when circumstances require them." The cabin lighting seemed to grow harsher, casting sharp shadows across faces that were beginning to show the strain of witnessing an interaction that everyone understood was wrong, but nobody seemed able to stop. Elijah's hands moved to his backpack straps, not because he intended to comply with Rebecca's order, but because holding on to something familiar provided a small measure of comfort in a situation that felt increasingly out of his control. "Could you please explain what circumstances require moving me from my assigned seat?" Elijah asked, the question containing both genuine confusion and the first hints of the quiet strength that would soon surprise everyone watching. His father had taught him that people in authority positions should be able to explain their decisions, especially when those decisions affected other people's rights and dignity. Rebecca's face flushed with the particular shade of red that comes from being challenged by someone who was supposed to accept authority without question, and her next words would determine whether this remained a civil disagreement or became something that required medical attention, legal intervention, and congressional hearings. "You know what that's enough?" "Walter," Foster said, his voice cutting through the cabin tension like a saw blade through pine, rough and authoritative, in the way that only comes from 74 years of watching the world and developing strong opinions about right and wrong. He unbuckled his seatbelt with movements that were deliberate rather than rushed, his arthritic hands working the mechanism with the careful precision of someone who had decided that sitting silently was no longer an option. Margaret Foster's whispered protests about not getting involved fell on deaf ears as Walter rose from his seat, his 6-foot frame still imposing despite the slight stoop that decades of construction work had carved into his shoulders. "Son, you haven't done a single thing wrong since you sat down in that seat," he said, directing his words to Elijah while keeping his eyes locked on Rebecca Walsh. "You've been polite, you've been respectful, and you've shown more maturity in 5 minutes than some adults manage in a lifetime." The intervention shifted the entire dynamic in the first-class cabin, transforming what had been a private confrontation between a flight attendant and an unaccompanied minor into a public disagreement with multiple witnesses and competing versions of appropriate behavior. Rebecca's face darkened with the kind of anger that comes from having one's authority challenged by someone who had no official standing to question her decisions, and her response would determine whether Walter's courage inspired others to speak up or simply made him a target for the same treatment Elijah was receiving. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the sharp edge that airline personnel used when they wanted to remind passengers about federal regulations and the serious consequences of interfering with crew operations. "This is an operational matter involving passenger safety protocols, and passenger interference could result in your removal from this aircraft and potential federal charges for disrupting a commercial flight." Walter's laugh was short and bitter, the sound of someone who had worked construction jobs for 40 years and wasn't easily intimidated by threats from people who had never faced real consequences for their actions. "Lady, I've been flying longer than you've been working, and I've never seen a safety protocol that involved harassing a 10-year-old boy for sitting in the seat his father paid for," he said, his voice growing louder despite Margaret's continued attempts to pull him back into his seat. Janet Lew was recording now, her phone held discreetly at an angle that captured both Walter's defense of Elijah and Rebecca's increasingly aggressive responses, while her business training kicked in with the recognition that she was witnessing the kind of incident that could generate millions of views on social media and destroy corporate reputations within hours. The video quality wasn't perfect, but the audio was crystal clear and every word was being preserved for the investigation that was beginning to feel inevitable. "Mr. Foster, please sit down," Sophia Martinez said, approaching with the kind of diplomatic urgency that junior employees used when they could see disasters unfolding but lacked the authority to prevent them. "I'm sure we can resolve this situation without disrupting other passengers or escalating the conflict beyond what's necessary for everyone's comfort and safety." Her words were professional and measured, but her eyes showed the strain of watching a situation spiral beyond her control. Elijah remained in his seat throughout the growing confrontation, his hands folded in his lap with the kind of unnatural stillness that children develop when adults are arguing about them, but not with them. The watch on his wrist felt heavier than before, and he found himself running his thumb across the smooth surface while trying to decide whether this situation qualified as an emergency that required his father's immediate intervention. "This young man has been nothing but respectful since he boarded this aircraft." Walter continued, his voice growing stronger as he settled into the familiar rhythm of standing up for people who couldn't defend themselves. He showed his ticket, he showed his letter. He answered every question you asked, and now you're trying to force him out of a seat he has every right to occupy. His words were measured and factual, but underneath the surface, composure was the barely controlled fury of someone who had spent decades watching injustice and had finally reached his limit. Rebecca's response came with the kind of cold precision that people use when they've decided that reasonable discussion is no longer possible and that force, either physical or administrative, might be required to maintain their version of order. "Sir, you are now interfering with the lawful execution of my duties as senior flight attendant, and I am within my rights to have you removed from this aircraft for passenger interference and disruption of commercial aviation operations." The threat carried real weight because everyone in first class understood that flight attendants possessed extraordinary authority once aircraft doors were closed, and that challenging their decisions could result in federal charges, lifetime flying bans, and social media infamy that could destroy careers and reputations. Walter Foster understood these stakes as clearly as anyone, but something in Elijah's quiet dignity and Rebecca's obvious prejudice had triggered a sense of moral outrage that made the potential consequences seem less important than doing the right thing. "Then remove me," Walter said, settling back into his seat with the calm satisfaction of someone who had drawn a line in the sand and was prepared to face whatever consequences came from defending it. "But I'm not going to sit here quietly while you bully a child for the crime of flying while black in first class." The words were spoken quietly, but they carried across the cabin with the clarity of absolute truth, and the silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Margaret Foster's face had gone pale, not from fear of the consequences her husband might face, but from the recognition that they had just crossed a point of no return that would define the rest of their flight and possibly the rest of their lives. Janet Lou's phone was still recording, capturing not just the confrontation, but the broader pattern of behavior that was beginning to emerge as other passengers shifted in their seats and exchanged meaningful glances. David Kim closed his newspaper entirely and began reaching for his phone, though his movements were careful and deliberate rather than urgent because his training had taught him that the most dangerous moments in any protection scenario were the ones where multiple variables were changing simultaneously and where a single wrong decision could escalate a manageable situation into something requiring federal intervention. The cabin air felt thick with tension that had moved beyond mere disagreement into the territory where people's fundamental beliefs about fairness and authority would be tested in ways that couldn't be taken back or explained away. And Rebecca Walsh's next words would determine whether this remained a confrontation between individuals or became something that would require congressional hearings to fully understand. "I'm going to ask you one final time to gather your belongings and move to your proper seating area," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that comes from someone who has been challenged beyond their tolerance level and is preparing to use whatever authority they possess to restore their version of order. The words were directed at Elijah, but her eyes were scanning the first-class cabin with the calculating assessment of someone who understood that multiple passengers were now questioning her authority and that decisive action was required to maintain control of the situation. Elijah looked up at her with the kind of steady gaze that his father had taught him to use in difficult situations, showing respect for authority while refusing to be intimidated by people who were using their power inappropriately. "Ma'am, could I please just have a glass of water while you contact your supervisor about my seating?" he asked, his voice carrying the careful politeness that 10-year-olds used when they were trying to de-escalate adult conflicts they didn't fully understand but instinctively recognized as dangerous. The request was so reasonable, so modest, so completely appropriate that it should have reminded Rebecca Walsh that she was dealing with a child who was trying to be helpful rather than defiant. But instead it seemed to trigger something in her that had been building since the moment she first saw Elijah in seat 2B. "You don't make demands when you're out of compliance with airline policy." She snapped her professional mask, finally dissolving entirely to reveal the resentment and frustration that had been simmering beneath her authoritative exterior. Janet Lou's phone was capturing everything now, the video quality sharp enough to show the expressions on both faces, the audio clear enough to document every word of an exchange that was spiraling beyond routine passenger service into territory that would require legal analysis and media scrutiny. Her business training had taught her to recognize moments when documentation became more important than discretion, and every instinct she possessed was telling her that this conversation would eventually be replayed in courtrooms and congressional hearing rooms. "Rebecca, I think we should contact the captain about this situation," Sophia Martinez interjected, her voice carrying the careful diplomacy of someone who understood that the situation had moved beyond routine passenger management into territory that required supervisory intervention. "Perhaps we could delay takeoff for a few minutes while we verify the passenger documentation through official channels and ensure that all protocols have been followed correctly." The suggestion was perfectly reasonable, exactly the kind of procedural solution that should have been implemented 20 minutes earlier, but Rebecca's response made it clear that this was no longer about following procedures or resolving documentation questions. "Sophia, This is exactly why senior flight attendants make decisions about passenger compliance rather than leaving those decisions to staff members who don't understand the broader implications of cabin management, she said, with the patronizing tone that people used when they wanted to assert hierarchy in front of witnesses. David Kim was no longer pretending to read his newspaper. His attention focused entirely on the escalating confrontation while his hand moved subtly toward the encrypted phone that would connect him directly to Thompson Aerospace's Security Operations Center. His training had taught him to recognize the specific combination of prejudice, authority, and escalation that could turn routine encounters into situations requiring federal intervention, and every warning signal in his professional experience was flashing red. "I'm not making demands," Elijah said, his voice growing smaller despite his efforts to maintain confidence. "I just asked for water because my throat is dry, and I thought maybe if you talked to your supervisor we could figure out why there's confusion about my ticket." His words were measured and respectful, but underneath the surface politeness was the growing awareness that Rebecca Walsh wasn't interested in resolving confusion or following procedures, but was instead determined to remove him from first class regardless of his documentation or behavior. Walter Foster had been watching the exchange with the growing recognition that his earlier intervention hadn't improved the situation, but had instead made Rebecca more determined to assert her authority. And his construction worker instincts were telling him that the situation was about to escalate beyond verbal confrontation into something that would require immediate physical intervention. "Son, you don't need to justify asking for water," he said, his voice carrying across the cabin with the authority of someone who had spent decades supervising work sites and managing conflicts between people with different ideas about fairness and respect. The cabin lighting seemed to grow harsher as the confrontation continued, casting sharp shadows across faces that were beginning to show the strain of witnessing an interaction that everyone understood was fundamentally wrong, but that nobody seemed able to stop through reasonable intervention. Margaret Foster had her hand pressed to her mouth in the universal gesture of someone watching a disaster unfold in slow motion, while other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, torn between the social expectation of minding their own business and the moral imperative to intervene when children were being treated unfairly. "You need to learn your place," Rebecca said, the words falling across the cabin like acid rain, corrosive and impossible to ignore. The sentence contained so many layers of implication and prejudice that it seemed to crystallize everything that had been building since the moment she first approached Elijah's seat, transforming what could have been dismissed as a simple misunderstanding into something that revealed fundamental beliefs about who belonged in premium spaces and who had the authority to make those determinations. Elijah's response was so quiet that passengers had to lean forward to hear it clearly, but the words carried across the cabin with the devastating clarity of absolute truth, spoken by someone too young to understand the full implications of what he was revealing about the adult world. "I think my father would be very disappointed to know that someone was treating me this way just for asking for water," he said, his voice steady despite the tears that were beginning to form in the corners of his eyes. The watch on Elijah's wrist grew warm against his skin, not from any technological feature his father had built into the device, but from the increased blood flow that came with stress and the growing recognition that this situation had moved beyond his ability to manage through politeness and cooperation. Something deep in his chest was telling him that the time for trying to reason with Rebecca Walsh had passed, and that the next few seconds would determine whether this remained a painful but manageable experience or became something that would require his father's immediate intervention. Rebecca's hand was already rising before her conscious mind had fully processed the decision to strike her palm open and aimed at the side of Elijah's face with the kind of automatic aggression that comes from someone who has decided that words are no longer sufficient to establish dominance and control in a situation that has spiraled beyond their ability to manage through normal authority. The sound of the slap would echo through congressional hearing rooms, courtrooms, and living rooms across America for months to come. But in that moment, it was simply the sharp crack of an adult's palm against a child's cheek, followed by the kind of absolute silence that comes when everyone present understands that they have just witnessed something that cannot be undone, explained away, or forgotten. The crack of Rebecca's palm against Elijah's cheek reverberated through the first-class cabin like a gunshot in a library, sharp and violent, and impossible to pretend hadn't happened, followed immediately by a collective gasp that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the pressurized air. The sound was so unexpected, so fundamentally wrong in a space designed for comfort and safety, that for a moment everyone present, passengers, crew members, even Rebecca herself, seemed frozen in the aftermath of an action that had crossed every conceivable line of professional behavior and human decency. Elijah's head snapped to the right from the force of the blow, his thin neck unable to absorb the impact of an adult's full-strength slap, and the red handprint that immediately began to bloom across his dark skin seemed to glow under the cabin lighting like evidence of a crime that demanded witness testimony. His eyes went wide with shock and pain, not just physical pain, but the deeper trauma of being struck by someone in authority for reasons he still didn't understand. And his small body seemed to shrink into the leather seat, as if he could somehow disappear from a situation that had become too dangerous for a 10-year-old to navigate alone. "Oh my God," whispered Margaret Foster, her voice carrying the horror of someone witnessing child abuse in real time, her hand flying to cover her mouth as if she could somehow take back the sound that had just shattered the civilized atmosphere of commercial aviation. She hit him. "Walter, she actually hit that little boy," she said, her words tumbling over each other with the urgency of someone who couldn't quite believe what her own eyes had just witnessed. Walter Foster was already rising from his seat before his conscious mind had fully processed the implications of Rebecca's action, his 74-year-old body moving with the protective aggression that comes when decent people witness children being hurt by adults who should know better. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, his voice carrying the full weight of his outrage across the cabin. "He's 10 years old, you crazy woman." He asked for a glass of water. Janet Lou's phone was capturing everything in high-definition clarity, the video quality good enough to see the tears forming in Elijah's eyes, and the immediate regret that flashed across Rebecca's face before being replaced by defensive anger. Her finger hovered over the emergency dial function that would connect her directly to airport security, though part of her couldn't believe she was witnessing the kind of incident that would require federal investigation and congressional hearings. "I didn't mean," Rebecca began, her voice carrying the confused tone of someone who had acted on impulse and was just beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had done. But her words were cut off by the sound of David Kim's chair scraping against the cabin floor as he abandoned all pretense of being an ordinary passenger and moved toward the front of the cabin with the purposeful stride of someone trained to respond to security emergencies. "Ma'am, step away from the child immediately," David commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I am David Kim, head of security for Thompson Aerospace, and this child is under federal protection protocols that you have just violated in front of multiple witnesses with video documentation." The revelation hit the cabin like a second shockwave, transforming what passengers had understood as a random act of violence against an unaccompanied minor into something involving federal protection details and corporate security operations that most people only encountered in movies or news reports. Sophia Martinez took an involuntary step backward, her training having covered passenger disputes and medical emergencies, but not situations involving federal protection protocols and violent assaults against protected individuals. Elijah's hand moved slowly to his left cheek, his small fingers touching the burning skin where Rebecca's palm had made contact, and the careful composure he had maintained throughout the confrontation finally began to crack as tears started rolling down both sides of his face. "You hit me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying across the silent cabin with devastating clarity. "I asked for water, and you hit me." The words were simple enough for a kindergartner to understand, but they contained layers of legal, moral, and emotional complexity that would require teams of lawyers, psychologists, and congressional investigators to fully unpack. Rebecca Walsh had not merely slapped a difficult passenger or used excessive force during a routine confrontation. She had physically assaulted a child under federal protection while being recorded by multiple witnesses, creating a situation that would trigger security protocols designed to protect the families of people whose work involved national security implications. "Someone call the police," said a voice from the middle of the cabin. Though the speaker was impossible to identify in the chaos of multiple conversations happening simultaneously, as passengers realized they were witnessing something far more serious than a routine travel dispute. That woman just assaulted a child in front of 40 people. "I'm recording everything," Janet Liu announced, loudly enough for everyone to hear, her phone held high to capture both Elijah's tears and Rebecca's growing panic. "This is all being documented, including audio, and I'm uploading it to cloud storage so it can't be deleted or confiscated." Her business experience had taught her that evidence preservation was crucial in situations that would inevitably result in legal proceedings. Rebecca looked around the cabin with growing desperation as she began to understand that her 16-year career in commercial aviation had just ended in the most public and humiliating way possible, surrounded by witnesses who had watched her strike a child for asking for water. "I didn't know who he was," she said, as if Elijah's identity as a federal protection case made her assault more serious than hitting any other 10-year-old would have been. "It doesn't matter who he is," Walter Foster shouted, his voice cracking with emotion as he watched Elijah wipe tears from his face with the back of his small hand. "You don't hit children, period, end of discussion, regardless of who their parents are or what kind of protection they have." David Kim was already reaching for his encrypted phone, his fingers moving across the screen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had rehearsed emergency protocols countless times, but had hoped never to use them in an actual crisis situation. "This is Kim requesting immediate asset extraction for Alpha 7, he said into the device. "Child has been physically assaulted by airline personnel. Multiple witnesses, video evidence, situation requires immediate federal response." The conversation was brief but comprehensive, covering location details, threat assessment, and extraction logistics in the kind of professional shorthand that suggested this was not the first time Thompson Aerospace's security team had dealt with threats against family members, though it was certainly the first time those threats had materialized during routine commercial travel. Elijah's tears were falling steadily now, not from physical pain, but from the emotional trauma of being hit by an adult for reasons that still made no sense to his 10-year-old understanding of fairness and appropriate behavior. The watch on his wrist felt warm against his skin, and some instinct that his father had planted during their morning conversation told him that pressing the crown for 3 seconds would bring help. Though he hesitated because part of him still hoped the situation could be resolved without involving the kind of federal response that would turn a simple flight into a national news story. Elijah's thumb found the crown of his watch, with the automatic precision of muscle memory pressing and holding the small metal button while counting slowly to 3 in his head, the way his father had taught him that morning in the airport lounge. Though the morning felt like a lifetime ago, and the excited boy who had been looking forward to visiting his grandmother seemed like a different person entirely. The watch face remained dark for several long seconds, then pulsed once with a soft blue light that was barely visible unless someone knew to look for it, followed by a series of rapid vibrations against his wrist that felt like Morse code but were actually encrypted location and status signals being transmitted to security operations centers across multiple federal agencies. 300 miles away in Thompson, Aerospace's headquarters outside Detroit, a bank of monitors in the Security Operations Center suddenly flashed red as Emergency Protocol Alpha 7 activated systems that had been tested monthly but never deployed during an actual crisis. Senior Operations Coordinator Maria Santos was reaching for her encrypted phone before the second pulse had finished transmitting her training, kicking in with the automatic precision that comes from years of preparation for scenarios that everyone hoped would never occur. Control to Sierra 1. We have Alpha 7 activation from commercial flight 847, departing Chicago. O'Hare, Santos said into her headset, her voice calm despite the adrenaline surge that came with coordinating federal protection responses. Asset is 10-year-old Elijah Thompson confirmed physical assault by airline personnel. Federal protection status confirmed, immediate extraction required. Michael Thompson was in his corner office reviewing quarterly defense contracts when his personal phone began vibrating with the specific pattern that he had programmed to override every possible distraction, including board meetings, congressional briefings, and conversations with Pentagon officials. The sound cut through his concentration like an emergency broadcast, and the blood drained from his face as he saw the caller ID that he had hoped never to see during his son's routine travel to visit family. "Maria, talk to me," Michael said, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone who had spent 15 years building systems designed to protect his family from threats that came with success in the defense industry, but had never imagined those systems would be needed to protect his son from airline employees during routine domestic travel. Sir Elijah activated his emergency beacon 6 minutes ago during a confrontation with airline personnel that escalated to physical assault. Santos reported, her voice professional, despite the personal horror she felt at having to deliver news that every parent dreads receiving. Our embedded security detail confirms multiple witnesses' video documentation and federal protection protocol violations that require immediate law enforcement response. The words hit Michael like physical blows, each detail adding to a growing picture of his son being hurt by people who should have been protecting him, and the careful control that had made him successful in high-stakes business negotiations began to crack under the weight of parental rage that threatened to overwhelm his ability to think strategically about response protocols. "Status of the aircraft," Michael asked, his voice tight with the effort required to focus on logistics rather than the mental image of his son being struck by an adult stranger for reasons that no 10-year-old should have to understand. "David Kim is on scene and has taken control of the immediate situation," Santos replied, referring to the security detail that Michael had insisted on despite Elijah's protests about wanting to travel independently. "The aircraft is still at the gate doors are sealed, and we're coordinating with airport security and FBI field office for immediate law enforcement response." Michael was already moving toward his private elevator, his mind racing through the implications of federal assault charges against airline personnel and the media attention that would inevitably follow once video of the incident reached social media platforms. "I want that plane grounded until I arrive," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his instructions followed without question. "No takeoff, no passenger movement, and I want every piece of video evidence secured before anyone has a chance to delete or modify documentation." "Already in progress, sir," Santos confirmed. "FAA has been notified and they're coordinating with Premium Airlines management for immediate compliance with federal protection protocols. The aircraft will remain at the gate until you provide authorization for next steps." On the aircraft, David Kim was coordinating with airport security through his encrypted communication system while maintaining visual contact with both Elijah and Rebecca Walsh, who seemed to be experiencing some combination of shock and growing awareness that her career in aviation had just ended in the most public way possible. "Roger that, control," Kim said into his phone. "Asset is secure but traumatized. Suspect is contained. Witnesses are cooperative. Video evidence is being preserved by multiple passengers." The cabin had fallen into an eerie quiet, broken only by whispered conversations between passengers who were beginning to understand that they had witnessed something that would require federal investigation and possibly congressional hearings, while Elijah sat in his seat, touching his burning cheek and trying to process the fact that an adult had hit him for asking for water during what was supposed to be a routine flight to visit his grandmother. "Control, this is Thompson." Michael's voice came through David Kim's earpiece with crystal clarity. I'm 20 minutes out by helicopter ETA 1430 hours, and I want a complete tactical briefing before I board that aircraft. His tone carried the controlled fury of a father who was discovering that all the money and security systems in the world couldn't protect his child from human prejudice and violence during routine activities that should have been completely safe. Rebecca Walsh was standing near the galley entrance, looking around the cabin with growing desperation as she began to comprehend that multiple passengers were recording video that would be shared on social media platforms within minutes, creating permanent documentation of her assault against a child that would follow her for the rest of her life, regardless of whatever legal consequences she might face through official channels. Mrs. Walsh, I need you to remain exactly where you are and avoid any further interaction with passengers. David Kim said, his voice carrying the polite firmness that security professionals used when they wanted to avoid escalating situations that were already beyond reasonable control. Federal agents will be boarding within minutes to take statements and secure evidence, and any attempt to leave the aircraft or interfere with witnesses could result in additional federal charges. Sophia Martinez stood frozen near the beverage cart, her mind racing through company training that had covered passenger disputes, medical emergencies, and even hijacking scenarios, but had never addressed situations involving federal protection protocols or assault charges against senior crew members, leaving her completely unprepared for the legal and professional implications of witnessing a child being struck by her supervisor during routine passenger service. The watch on Elijah's wrist vibrated again, and somehow he understood that this pulse meant help was coming, that his father knew what had happened, and was taking steps to make sure the situation would be resolved in a way that protected him from further harm. Though the knowledge that adults could hit children for asking reasonable questions would remain with him for the rest of his life, changing his understanding of how the world worked in ways that no amount of justice or compensation could completely repair. The first indication that something extraordinary was happening came through the aircraft's communication system as Captain Rodriguez received a priority message that superseded all standard flight operations protocols and required immediate compliance regardless of scheduling implications or passenger convenience. Premium Flight 847, this is O'Hare Ground Control with Federal Priority Override. The tower announced, their voice carrying the particular urgency that air traffic controllers used when situations moved beyond routine aviation management into territory requiring law enforcement coordination. Ground Control, this is Premium 847. We're ready for pushback and departure, Captain Rodriguez replied, though something in the controller's tone suggested that normal departure procedures were no longer applicable to his aircraft, and his 23 years of commercial aviation experience had taught him to recognize when routine flights became something much more serious. Negative on departure authorization, Premium 847, Ground Control responded immediately. You are ordered to return to Gate B7 and maintain position for federal law enforcement boarding. This is not a request. This is a federal priority directive that supersedes all commercial aviation schedules, and compliance is mandatory under Title 49 Aviation Security Regulations. The words hit the cockpit like a physical blow, transforming what should have been a routine departure into a federal incident that would require immediate coordination with FBI field offices, Transportation Security Administration, protocols, and whatever federal agencies were responsible for protecting passengers who traveled under special security classifications that Captain Rodriguez had never encountered during his commercial aviation career. Copy that. Ground Control Rodriguez replied, his voice steady, despite the growing realization that someone in his cabin was important enough to trigger federal protection protocols, and that something had happened during boarding that required immediate law enforcement response. Premium 847, returning to Gate B7 and maintaining position for federal law enforcement boarding. The aircraft's engines began the slow process of reversing their startup procedures while Captain Rodriguez reached for the intercom that would connect him to the cabin crew. Though his standard passenger announcement scripts had never covered situations involving federal law enforcement boarding and potential assault charges against crew members, leaving him to improvise explanations for delays that he didn't fully understand himself. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez from the flight deck. His voice announced throughout the cabin, carrying the careful professionalism that pilots used when they needed to convey seriousness without creating panic among passengers who were already stressed by unexpected delays. We've received instructions from ground control to return to our gate for a brief delay while we resolve an administrative matter with federal authorities. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we coordinate with airport security. The announcement created a ripple of confused murmurs throughout the cabin as passengers began to understand that their routine flight had been interrupted by something serious enough to require federal intervention, though most of them had no idea that they had witnessed a criminal assault against a child, or that video evidence of the incident was already being uploaded to social media platforms where it would be shared millions of times within hours. Through the aircraft windows, passengers could see airport security vehicles approaching the gate with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested this was not a routine security check, but rather a full federal response to a situation that required immediate law enforcement intervention. 3 unmarked black SUVs positioned themselves around the gate area while uniformed officers established a perimeter that would prevent unauthorized access to the aircraft during evidence collection and witness interviews. David Kim was coordinating the security response through his encrypted phone while maintaining visual surveillance of both Elijah and Rebecca Walsh, who seemed to be oscillating between shock and growing awareness that her 16-year aviation career had just ended in the most public and legally complicated way possible. "Control this is Kim on scene," he reported. "Asset is secure, but traumatized suspect is contained. Multiple witnesses are preserving video evidence and we're ready for law enforcement boarding." Rebecca stood near the galley entrance with her hands shaking as she began to comprehend the full implications of having struck a child under federal protection while being recorded by multiple passengers, creating evidence that would be analyzed by federal prosecutors, congressional investigators, and social media audiences who would demand accountability for violence against children during routine commercial travel. "I didn't know," she whispered to Sofia Martinez, though her words carried no legal weight and provided no protection against the federal assault charges that were being prepared by prosecutors who specialized in crimes against individuals with special protection status. "I didn't know who he was or that he had federal protection." Sofia Martinez stared at her supervisor with the kind of horrified disbelief that comes from watching someone destroy their entire career through a single moment of violence that revealed prejudices and anger management issues that should have been addressed years earlier through proper training and psychological evaluation, but had instead been allowed to fester until they exploded against a 10-year-old child who had asked for water. The aircraft's doors opened to admit a team of federal agents who moved with the coordinated efficiency of people trained to secure crime scenes and interview witnesses in high-stakes situations that would inevitably attract media attention and congressional scrutiny, their presence transforming the first-class cabin from a commercial space into an active federal crime scene requiring evidence preservation and witness testimony. FBI. Special Agent Martinez announced the lead investigator, a woman in her 40s whose presence immediately commanded attention from everyone in the cabin. "We're here to investigate reports of assault against a minor under federal protection, and we'll need statements from all witnesses before anyone is allowed to leave this aircraft." Elijah remained in his seat throughout the federal response, his small hand still touching his burning cheek while he watched adults in suits and badges moving around the cabin, with the kind of serious efficiency that made him understand this situation had grown far beyond anything he could manage through politeness and cooperation, requiring the kind of adult intervention that his father had built into systems designed to protect him from exactly this type of prejudice and violence. The watch on his wrist vibrated one final time, and somehow he knew this meant his father was close, that the nightmare of being hit by a stranger for asking for water was almost over, though the memory of Rebecca Walsh's hand striking his face would remain with him for the rest of his life, as a reminder that some adults were dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with stranger danger or criminal intent, but rather with prejudice and power that could turn routine interactions into traumatic experiences that no child should have to endure. The helicopter's rotors were still spinning down on the airport tarmac when Michael Thompson emerged from the aircraft with the controlled urgency of a father whose child had been hurt by people who should have protected him. His usually immaculate business attire replaced by the casual clothes he had been wearing when the emergency call came through. Though his appearance did nothing to diminish the authority that came from 15 years of building aerospace defense systems and the personal security protocols that protected his family. Federal agents escorted Michael through the secure corridor that connected the helicopter landing zone to the gate, where Flight 847 remained grounded their presence, creating a perimeter of protection that kept media cameras and curious travelers at a distance, while allowing the kind of privacy that was necessary for a father to assess his child's condition without public scrutiny that would inevitably follow once news of the incident reached major media outlets. Daddy Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper, as Michael knelt beside seat 2B and gathered his son into his arms with the gentle intensity of someone who had spent the last 30 minutes imagining every possible scenario and was overwhelmed with relief to find that his child was physically safe, though the red mark on Elijah's cheek told a story that would require months of legal proceedings and psychological counseling to fully address. "I'm here, son," Michael whispered against Elijah's hair, breathing in the familiar scent of his child while feeling the slight tremor that indicated Elijah was still processing the trauma of being struck by an adult for reasons that no 10-year-old should have to understand. "You did everything right. You activated your watch, you stayed calm, and now we're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else's child." The embrace lasted several minutes while federal agents completed their initial evidence collection and witness interviews documenting video footage from multiple passengers and securing testimony that would form the foundation of criminal charges against Rebecca Walsh for assault on a minor under federal protection, a crime that carried serious jail time and would serve as a precedent for how airlines treated passengers with special security status. David Kim briefed Michael on the tactical situation with the kind of professional efficiency that came from years of protecting the Thompson family from threats that ranged from corporate espionage to kidnapping attempts. Though none of his previous experience had prepared him for dealing with violence during routine commercial travel that should have been completely safe for an unaccompanied minor. The assault was captured on video by multiple passengers, Kim reported. "We have clear evidence of the flight attendant striking Elijah twice across the face after he politely requested water, and witness testimony confirms that she was targeting him from the moment he boarded the aircraft based on racial prejudice rather than any violation of airline policies or safety protocols." Rebecca Walsh sat in the galley area under federal supervision, her 16-year career in commercial aviation having ended in handcuffs and Miranda warnings that informed her of constitutional rights she would need to exercise during court proceedings that would determine whether she faced jail time for assault against a child, though her greatest punishment might be the social media infamy that would follow her for the rest of her life. "I want to speak with my son privately," Michael told the federal agents, who immediately cleared the first-class cabin to provide the kind of father-son privacy that was necessary for emotional healing after traumatic experiences, though they maintained security positions throughout the aircraft to ensure that evidence preservation continued according to federal protocols. "Tell me what happened," Michael said, gently settling into the seat beside Elijah with the patient attention that good fathers used when their children needed to process difficult experiences through conversation and emotional support, rather than being rushed toward legal proceedings that would require their testimony. Elijah's account of the incident was delivered in the careful, factual tone that children used when they were trying to make sense of adult behavior that violated their understanding of fairness and appropriate conduct, his young voice steady, despite the tears that continued to fall as he described being questioned, threatened, and ultimately struck for requesting water during routine passenger service. "She kept saying I didn't belong in first class. Elijah said, his small hand unconsciously touching the watch that had brought help when reasonable discussion failed to resolve prejudice that had nothing to do with his behavior or documentation. She tore up your letter and said anyone could print fake papers, and when I asked for water, she said I was making demands from the floor. Michael's jaw tightened as he listened to his son describe discrimination that was both subtle and obvious. The kind of prejudice that allowed adults to rationalize their mistreatment of children based on assumptions about who belonged in premium spaces and who had the authority to make those determinations, creating psychological trauma that would require professional counseling to fully address. You did nothing wrong, Michael said firmly, using the tone that fathers employed when they needed their children to understand fundamental truths about justice and dignity that the world sometimes failed to demonstrate. You were polite. You showed your documents. You followed all the rules, and you were punished for the color of your skin rather than anything you did or said. The conversation was interrupted by FBI Special Agent Martinez, who needed to coordinate with Michael about evidence preservation and legal proceedings that would determine how the federal government prosecuted assault charges against airline employees who violated the civil rights of passengers under special protection, creating precedents that would affect how commercial aviation treated discrimination complaints. Mr. Thompson, we have everything we need to file federal assault charges against Rebecca Walsh, Agent Martinez reported. The video evidence is compelling, witness testimony is consistent, and the assault occurred against a minor under federal protection, which elevates this from a misdemeanor to a felony carrying serious jail time. Michael nodded, though his primary concern was ensuring that Elijah received appropriate psychological support for trauma that no child should experience during routine travel, and that the legal proceedings focused on preventing future discrimination, rather than simply punishing one individual whose prejudice had been exposed through video evidence and federal investigation. Premium Airlines' corporate executives were already implementing emergency protocols designed to prevent similar incidents, including immediate termination of Rebecca Walsh mandatory bias training for all cabin crew and enhanced protection procedures for unaccompanied minors who traveled under special security classifications, though these reforms could not undo the psychological trauma that Elijah had experienced. Congressional hearing rooms had witnessed testimony about airline safety, passenger rights, and discrimination complaints for decades, but the packed chamber that convened 3 days after Elijah Thompson's assault carried the electric tension of a watershed moment that would reshape commercial aviation policies and establish new federal protections for passengers who faced prejudice based on age, race, or perceived economic status during routine travel. Representative Sarah Chen gavelled the House Transportation Committee to order with the solemnity appropriate for proceedings that would examine not just individual criminal behavior, but also institutional failures that had allowed discrimination to flourish in commercial aviation through inadequate oversight, insufficient training, and corporate cultures that prioritized customer service efficiency over passenger civil rights and dignity. This committee convenes today to examine the assault of 10-year-old Elijah Thompson aboard Premium Airlines Flight 847. Representative Chen announced, her voice carrying across the hearing room to television cameras that would broadcast the proceedings to millions of viewers who had already seen viral video footage of Rebecca Walsh striking a child for requesting water during routine passenger service. Michael Thompson approached the witness table with the composed dignity of someone who had testified before Congress on defense contracting matters, but had never imagined he would be discussing his son's traumatic experience with airline discrimination in front of national television audiences and social media platforms that would amplify every word he spoke about prejudice and violence against children. Mr. Thompson, please tell the committee what happened to your son. Representative Chen requested, her tone combining the formal language of congressional proceedings with the human empathy that was appropriate for testimony about child abuse during commercial aviation operations that should have provided safety and dignity for passengers regardless of their age or appearance. Michael's testimony was delivered with the factual precision of someone trained to brief Pentagon officials on complex technical matters, but his voice carried the controlled emotion of a father describing his child's trauma to legislators who had the power to prevent similar incidents through enhanced federal oversight and mandatory training programs that addressed implicit bias in customer service operations. My son was traveling alone to visit his grandmother using proper documentation and behaving with the kind of respectful politeness that we teach children when they interact with adults in authority positions, Michael explained. He was targeted from the moment he boarded the aircraft, questioned about his right to occupy a seat his father had purchased, denied basic service, and ultimately struck across the face twice for requesting water. The video evidence played on committee room screens showed Rebecca Walsh's assault against Elijah, with crystal clarity, the audio capturing not just the sound of her palm striking his cheek, but also his polite requests for water and his confused questions about why he was being treated differently from other passengers, creating documentation that would be analyzed by legal scholars and civil rights advocates for decades. The flight attendant's behavior represents a pattern of discrimination that extends beyond individual prejudice to institutional failures in training, oversight, and accountability. Michael continued. Premium Airlines had received multiple complaints about Rebecca Walsh's treatment of passengers, particularly children and people of color, but failed to provide corrective training or disciplinary action that might have prevented my son's assault. Premium Airlines CEO David Morrison testified next, his prepared remarks combining corporate apologies with concrete policy changes designed to prevent future incidents through enhanced training programs, independent oversight of discrimination complaints, and zero-tolerance policies for crew members who violated passenger civil rights through verbal or physical abuse during routine travel operations. We have terminated Rebecca Walsh's employment and implemented comprehensive reforms that include mandatory bias training for all crew members, independent review of discrimination complaints, and enhanced protection protocols for unaccompanied minors, Morrison announced. These changes will ensure that no child experiences the trauma that Elijah Thompson suffered aboard our aircraft. The committee heard testimony from passenger witnesses who described watching Rebecca Walsh target Elijah from the moment he boarded the aircraft, questioning his documentation, denying him service, and ultimately striking him for requesting water with the kind of polite respect that adults should encourage in children, rather than punish through violence and humiliation that violated every principle of customer service and human dignity. I watched that flight attendant harass a 10-year-old boy for 20 minutes before she finally hit him, testified Walter Foster, his voice shaking with emotion as he described his failed attempts to intervene on Elijah's behalf. He was polite, he was respectful, he showed his ticket and his letter, and she punished him for being a black child in first class. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a child psychologist specializing in racial trauma, testified about the long-term psychological effects of discrimination and violence against children during routine activities that should reinforce their sense of safety and belonging in public spaces, rather than teaching them that prejudice could override documentation, politeness, and appropriate behavior when adults decided they didn't belong. Children who experience racial discrimination during routine activities develop heightened anxiety about public spaces, reduced trust in authority figures, and long-term psychological effects that require professional counseling to address. Dr. Rodriguez explained. The assault against Elijah Thompson represents the kind of institutional violence that creates lasting trauma extending far beyond the immediate physical injury. The hearing concluded with unanimous committee approval of the Passenger Dignity Act, federal legislation that mandated bias training for all commercial aviation personnel, independent oversight of discrimination complaints, enhanced protection for unaccompanied minors, and criminal penalties for crew members who violated passenger civil rights through verbal or physical abuse during routine travel operations. Representative Chen's closing remarks emphasized that Elijah's trauma had catalyzed legislative changes that would protect millions of passengers from discrimination. Though no amount of policy reform could undo the psychological damage caused by adults who allowed prejudice to override their professional responsibilities and basic human decency during routine customer service operations. This committee's work will ensure that Elijah Thompson's experience leads to meaningful reform rather than becoming another forgotten example of institutional discrimination, Representative Chen announced. The legislation we approve today will protect children and families from the kind of prejudice and violence that should have no place in American commercial aviation. Federal prosecutors had already filed assault charges against Rebecca Walsh that would result in criminal conviction, jail time, and permanent prohibition from working in commercial aviation, though her greatest punishment would be the social media infamy that documented her assault against a child for the entire world to witness and remember. 6 months after that terrible morning on Flight 847, Elijah Thompson sat at his father's desk in the Thompson Aerospace headquarters, carefully composing a letter that would be published in newspapers across the country and read aloud in schools where teachers wanted to help their students understand courage, forgiveness, and the difference between justice and revenge when adults failed to protect children from prejudice and violence. "Dear kids who look like me," Elijah wrote in handwriting that had grown more confident since that day when a stranger struck him for asking for water. Though his words carried the weight of experiences that most 10-year-olds never had to process through therapy sessions and conversations with father, who understood that some lessons about the world's cruelty came too early but couldn't be avoided. Someone hurt me because they thought I didn't belong somewhere I had every right to be. He continued choosing words that would help other children understand discrimination without losing hope in the fundamental goodness of most adults, or the possibility that speaking up could create change even when individual encounters felt overwhelming and dangerous. Michael watched his son write with the careful attention of a father who had learned that protecting children from prejudice required both immediate security responses and long-term efforts to help them process trauma in ways that built strength rather than fear. Though he would always carry guilt about failing to anticipate that routine commercial travel could expose his child to violence from people he had trusted to provide safety. "I forgive the lady who hit me." Elijah wrote the words, surprising even his father, who had spent months working through his own anger at Rebecca Walsh and the airline systems that had failed to protect his son from assault during routine passenger service. But forgiving doesn't mean pretending it didn't hurt or that it was okay. It means choosing to focus on making things better instead of staying angry forever. The letter would eventually reach millions of children through social media platforms, school reading programs, and family discussions about discrimination and resilience, though its most important audience was Elijah himself, who was learning to transform trauma into wisdom and pain into purpose, through the kind of emotional processing that would serve him throughout his life. If someone treats you badly because of how you look or where they think you belong, remember that their prejudice says something about them, not about you. He continued, "You belong anywhere. Your ticket says you belong anywhere. Your family can afford to take you anywhere. You treat other people with respect and kindness." Rebecca Walsh was serving her federal sentence in minimum security prison, participating in counseling programs designed to address the prejudice and anger that had cost her career, her reputation, and her freedom. Though her path toward redemption would be long and uncertain, requiring the kind of honest self-examination that most people avoided until, forced by consequences, they couldn't escape or explain away. The Passenger Dignity Act had been signed into law by the President in a ceremony that honored Elijah's courage while establishing federal protections for passengers who faced discrimination during commercial travel, creating oversight mechanisms and training requirements that would prevent other children from experiencing assault for requesting water or occupying seats their families had purchased. Premium airlines had implemented comprehensive reforms that exceeded federal requirements, including body cameras for crew members, independent review of discrimination complaints, enhanced training programs focused on implicit bias, and compensation funds for passengers who experienced mistreatment during travel, though these changes couldn't erase the trauma that Elijah had endured. The world changed because people like Walter and Margaret Foster stood up for me, even though they didn't know me. Elijah wrote, remembering the elderly couple who had visited him at home and become surrogate grandparents, who reminded him that courage came in many forms, including strangers who risked their own comfort to protect children from adults who had forgotten their fundamental responsibilities. David Kim had been promoted to head of corporate security for Thompson Aerospace, his protective instincts having prevented a dangerous situation from becoming a complete disaster, though he would always wonder if earlier intervention might have protected Elijah from the trauma that no amount of professional security training could completely prevent. Sophia Martinez now directed passenger relations training for premium airlines, using her experience witnessing discrimination and assault to help other crew members recognize and interrupt prejudice before it escalated to violence, her career having found new purpose in preventing the kind of institutional failure that had allowed Rebecca Walsh's prejudice to flourish unchecked. I want other kids to know that asking for help isn't giving up, and that good adults will protect you when bad adults forget that children deserve respect and kindness. Elijah concluded his letter. My father always taught me that I belong everywhere I go, and now I want to teach other kids the same thing, because belonging isn't something adults get to take away just because they don't like how we look. Michael read the completed letter with tears in his eyes, recognizing in his son's words the kind of wisdom that trauma sometimes created in young people who were forced to understand prejudice earlier than childhood should require, though Elijah's capacity for forgiveness and hope reminded his father that resilience could grow from even the most painful experiences. The letter was published on a Tuesday morning in newspapers across the country, shared millions of times on social media platforms, and read aloud in thousands of classrooms where teachers helped students discuss courage, dignity, and the importance of standing up for people who were being treated unfairly by adults who should have known better. Years later, when Elijah Thompson graduated from college with degrees in aerospace engineering and civil rights law, he would remember that terrible morning on Flight 847 as the day he learned that individual courage could create institutional change, that children's voices could reach congressional hearing rooms, and that forgiveness was not weakness, but rather the foundation of justice that focused on preventing future harm, rather than simply punishing past mistakes. The watch his father had given him remained in a place of honor on his desk, a reminder that love manifested itself through preparation and protection, but also through the teaching of values that would help children navigate a world where prejudice still existed, but where speaking up could create change one conversation and one letter at a time. 3 years after flight, 847 airports across America displayed posters featuring the Passenger Dignity Act, with Elijah's words serving as a reminder that commercial travel should be safe and respectful for passengers regardless of age, race, or economic status. The legislation had prevented hundreds of discrimination incidents through enhanced training and oversight, proving that individual trauma could generate institutional change when supported by federal law and corporate accountability. Rebecca Walsh completed her sentence and now works in community service programs that address bias and anger management. Her path toward redemption serving as evidence that people could change when forced to confront the prejudice that had cost them everything they thought they valued. Her story became a cautionary tale in training programs that taught customer service employees about the consequences of letting implicit bias override professional responsibilities. Elijah Thompson now 13 flies regularly for school trips and family vacations, always treated with the respect and dignity that should be standard for every passenger. His experience having created policies that protect millions of children who travel without understanding how close they came to experiencing discrimination that could have shaped their entire relationship with public spaces and authority figures. The boy who asked for water and received violence in return had grown into a young man whose voice would continue to advocate for justice, dignity, and the fundamental truth that everyone belongs wherever their ticket says they belong.